The thing about humans is, nobody briefs you properly. You get the standard orientation packet when you join a multi-species coalition crew. You get the dietary restriction list, the cultural sensitivity modules, the 17-page document about why you should never compliment a Vorkai on their secondary eyebrows because apparently that means something entirely different in their culture, and I will not elaborate further. You get all of that. What you do not get, what nobody thinks to include in any of the paperwork, is a single paragraph, just one paragraph, explaining what happens when a human decides that today is a good day to do something completely, catastrophically, magnificently insane. I am Velhari Us, Senior Observation Specialist aboard the Coalition research vessel Murmur of Distant Stars, and I have been taking notes. Let me tell you about Lieutenant Priya Natthakon. She was not supposed to be the hero of this story. To be perfectly transparent with you, when I first reviewed the crew manifest and saw her assignment, I noted her down as, quote, human female, tactical support, medium threat evaluation, probably fine. That was my professional assessment. I stand by the thoroughness of my methodology, if not the conclusion. Priya was 29 years old by human reckoning, which in human terms means she was basically still assembling herself as a person, still figuring out the precise ratio of confidence to recklessness that defines their species in its prime. She had dark eyes that seemed to be calculating something at all times, even when she was eating, even when she was sleeping, probably. Short hair, kept close because she found it practical, a laugh that arrived suddenly and left just as fast, like it startled even her. She spoke 3 languages fluently, 2 poorly, and 1 she claimed exclusively during emergencies. We would later confirm this. She was assigned to the Murmur of Distant Stars because the Coalition needed someone who could interface with the ship's manual override systems in the event of primary computer failure. Humans, it turns out, are the only species patient enough to actually learn manual override protocols without developing what the medical team diplomatically calls stress-induced existential paralysis. Every other species looks at a manual system and immediately wants to know why it isn't automated. Humans look at a manual system and think, oh good, something I can actually touch. This trait, as we will discuss, saved several lives, but I am getting ahead of myself. The story does not begin with Priya saving anyone. It begins, as so many Coalition stories do, with something going wrong in the most boring, administrative, completely avoidable way possible. The Murmur of Distant Stars was conducting a standard geological survey of a system in the outer arm, a system that the charts described as, and I quote directly, geologically inactive, low risk, preliminary scan recommended but not required. Whoever wrote that description was either negligent, overworked, or had never met a planet before, because the third body in that system, a gray-green rock the crew had taken to calling Pebble for reasons that were initially charming and later seemed like tempting fate, was not geologically inactive, it was geologically furious. Our lead geologist, a Fethrani named Das Vel Kanur, had been arguing for a deeper scan for 3 days. Das Vel Kanur was tall, extremely patient, and possessed of a voice so calm that crew members sometimes fell asleep during his briefings through no fault of their own, including, on one occasion, the captain. This did not help his case. His requests were filed, reviewed, and scheduled for consideration at the next resource allocation meeting, which was 11 days away. 11 days was, as it turned out, about 10 days and 23 hours too long. The surface team that landed on Pebble consisted of 5 members. Das Velkanor, who was right about everything and deeply unhappy about it. Lieutenant Priya Natthakon, on Overwatch and systems support. A Mulan biologist named Choriv, who was there to catalog potential microbial life and who had brought, inexplicably, a small decorative plant from her quarters because she said surveys felt lonely without it. A young Terith engineer named Fedosi Beck, fresh out of training, eager, slightly terrified of everything, and constitutionally incapable of standing still. And the team lead, a veteran Vorkai named Eshori Tun, who had done 47 surface surveys and considered herself basically immune to surprise. She was about to update that assessment. The first 12 minutes of the survey were uneventful. Das Volcanor took readings. Chorov introduced her plant to the local atmosphere in a way that the rest of the team pretended not to notice. Fedosi Beck ran equipment checks with the energy of someone who had been told to look busy. HFY Tun stood at the edge of a ridge and scanned the horizon with the relaxed authority of someone who has done this 47 times. Priya sat on a rock and ate something from a small container, a habit of hers during downtime that the crew had learned not to ask about because she would describe it in detail, and the details were not always appetizing. She was watching the ground, not the horizon, the ground. Later, when I reviewed her debrief, I asked her what she had noticed. She said the vibration pattern in the soil was wrong. She said it felt like the planet was breathing, but not regularly, more like something was winding up. When I asked how she had detected vibrational anomalies through her boot soles during a routine survey she described as, and again I quote, "pretty chill so far," she looked at me for a long moment and said, "I grew up near a fault line. You learn to feel things. I do not know what to do with that information. I have simply accepted it." The eruption, when it came, did not behave like a standard geological event. Pebble, apparently, did not do standard geological events. What it did was split a seam in the rock face approximately 40 meters to the team's east and emit a column of superheated material at a velocity that our instruments reviewing the data afterward classified as impressive and deeply inadvisable. The initial shock wave crossed the survey site in under 2 seconds. It was not the lava that was the immediate problem. It was the pressure front which struck the team like a physical object. Because it was a physical object, Fedosi Beck was knocked flat and immediately started shouting in Terath. Chorov's plant became briefly airborne. Das Volcanor grabbed his equipment and moved with the resigned efficiency of someone who has been right about a dangerous situation and is experiencing no satisfaction from it whatsoever. HFY Tun, 47 surveys, veteran of half a dozen difficult postings, moved to call the extraction immediately. She got 2 words into the call before the secondary vent opened. It opened directly beneath the section of ridge where she was standing. In the debrief, HFY Tun described the moment with characteristic Vorkai understatement. She said the ground became unreliable. What she meant was that the ridge fractured along a pre-existing seam that the insufficient preliminary scan had not detected, and a section approximately 6 meters wide dropped 3 meters in under a second, taking HFY Tun with it. She landed hard. Her suit registered 2 cracked lower limb segments, which in Vorkai anatomy is roughly equivalent to 2 broken legs in human terms. The environmental integrity of her suit held, fortunately, but she was down, she was injured, and she was now surrounded on 3 sides by freshly exposed volcanic rock that was climbing in temperature with significant enthusiasm. The gap between her position and the rest of the team was not enormous. Maybe 8 meters of broken terrain, across a surface that was fractured, unstable, increasingly hot, and actively venting in 2 separate locations. Doable, theoretically, if you had the right equipment and the right timing and the right threshold for sensible risk assessment. HFY Tun looked up from where she had landed. She could see her team across the gap. She could see Das Volcanor already on comms trying to reach the ship. She could see Fedosi Beck on his feet again, frozen, running calculations she could practically watch him abandon in real time. She could see Chorov clutching her plant with one arm and a ridge anchor with the other, and she could see Priya Natthakon. This is the part of the story that I have replayed from the suit recordings many times. I have shown it to colleagues. I showed it to a Vorkai combat historian who said nothing for a very long time, and then said, quietly, "Extraordinary." I showed it to a theoretical xenobiologist who studies human behavior patterns, and she watched it twice, and then said she needed to update 3 separate papers. I showed it to another human, one of the engineers on the station where I wrote this report, and he watched it and just kind of nodded and said, "Yeah, that tracks, that tracks." Priya Natthakon did not pause. I want to be precise about this because it is important. The suit recordings show a gap of approximately 1.4 seconds between the moment the ridge fractured and the moment Priya was already moving. 1.4 seconds. In that time, she had assessed the situation, calculated a route, and committed. There was no visible hesitation. There was no moment of, oh no, this is bad, let me think about this. There was a problem requiring a solution, and a human who had apparently decided the solution was her. She crossed the unstable terrain in a way that I can only describe as controlled falling. She was not running, exactly. She was using the irregular surface, pushing off angles, redistributing weight constantly, and she was doing it at a speed that our sensors logged as approximately 6 meters per second, which on broken, fracturing, thermally active rock should not have been physically achievable, and yet there she was, achieving it. The first vent she crossed by timing the emission interval, which she had been watching, I now realize, since well before the eruption. She cleared it with maybe a quarter-second margin. The second vent she simply jumped over, which was not a gap I would have classified as jumpable, and she made it look inconvenient rather than impossible. She reached Ishari-Tun's position 7 seconds after the fracture. 7 seconds. Ishari-Tun looked up at her. Later, she told me that in that moment, with the temperature rising and the ground still moving, and the very real possibility that the section she had landed on was going to drop further, she had been composing what she mentally called her final report. Not a prayer, not a message to family, a report. She was Vorkai, and she was professional to the last. She had concluded in those several seconds of isolation that extraction was unlikely, and then there was a human crouching next to her, calm as anything, saying, "Okay, I need you to put your arm around my shoulder. We're going to do this together. Can you tell me which side hurts less?" Ishari-Tun told me, weeks later, that she did not understand the question at first, not because of language, the translators were functioning perfectly, but because she had never, in 47 surveys and 30 years of coalition service, had someone arrive in the middle of a crisis and ask what she needed. She said it was the most disorienting experience of her career, including the eruption. She told Priya the left side hurt less. Priya nodded, shifted position, and they started moving. Getting Ishari-Tun across that terrain was not elegant. I want to be clear about that, because the suit recordings show something that looks from a distance almost choreographed. And it was absolutely not choreographed. It was two beings moving across an actively disintegrating surface, one of them injured, the other making decisions so fast that her own suit's biometric sensors logged her heart rate as elevated, but her breathing as controlled, which the medical team later described as physiologically interesting, and which Priya described as how I get when I'm focused. Focused. The planet was erupting. Focused. The route back was not the same route Priya had taken coming in. That route no longer existed. A section of it had dropped another 1.5 meters in the time it took her to reach Ishari-Tun, and 2 new thermal vents had opened along the original path, which the planet had apparently added just to be thorough. So Priya was navigating in real time, with an injured Vorkai officer whose weight distribution was entirely different from a human's, across terrain that was revising itself every few seconds, and she was doing it while talking, not panicking. Talking, she kept up a low, steady commentary the entire way. Not to the team on comms, not to the ship, but to Ishari-Tun. "Okay, step here. This section feels solid. That one doesn't. We're going left. I've got you. Don't try to take weight on that side. Almost there. I can see Ferdowsi from here. He looks terrified. That's fine. He's standing up." Ishari-Tun told me afterward that the commentary was the thing that kept her functional, not the physical support, though that mattered enormously. The voice. The absolute baffling certainty in that voice, as if Priya had already seen how this ended and was simply narrating the path to get there. Ferdowsi Bek, to his enormous credit, had stopped being frozen. The moment he saw Priya moving, something in him had apparently recalibrated, because he grabbed a tension line from the equipment pack and anchored it to the most stable outcrop he could find, and threw the other end across the gap without being asked. It fell short the first time. He pulled it back and threw it again. It reached. Priya caught it one-handed without breaking stride, which is a sentence I genuinely did not expect to write in any official report ever, and used it to stabilize the final crossing. They came over the edge together. Fadosi Bek grabbed Ashari Tun's other side immediately. Choriv, who had anchored herself and her plant and pulled out a field medical kit with admirable efficiency, was already there. Das Velcanor had the extraction beacon active and was relaying coordinates to the ship, with the focus of someone who has decided that feelings are for after the emergency. The extraction shuttle reached them 4 minutes and 17 seconds later. Those 4 minutes felt, I am told, extremely long aboard the shuttle. Once Ashari Tun was stabilized, and Fadosi Bek had stopped shaking visibly, and Choriv's plant had been confirmed to have survived with only minor thermal stress, which Choriv announced with genuine relief, there was a long moment of silence. The kind of silence that happens after something very loud and very dangerous finally stops. Priya was sitting against the shuttle wall, checking her suit's integrity readouts. Her hands, I noticed in the recording, were steady. Completely steady. She found a thermal score along her left forearm where she had come too close to one of the vents, ran a diagnostic on it, and then set it aside and looked out the small viewport at the planet below, which was still erupting with impressive commitment. Ritun, from the medical brace Choriv had fitted her into, looked at Priya for a long moment. "You came across that terrain," she said. Not a question, just a statement, the way you say something when you are still processing whether it actually happened. Priya looked over at her. "Yeah, you crossed 2 active thermal vents. The intervals were pretty regular, once you watch them for a bit." Ashari Tun was quiet for another moment. "You were watching them before the eruption. Seemed worth watching, because of the vibrations, among other things." Another silence. Then Ashari Tun said, with the careful precision of someone choosing words for accuracy rather than comfort, "I had concluded that extraction was unlikely." Priya looked at her. Something moved across her face that I have reviewed many times and still find difficult to categorize. It was not quite a smile and not quite something more serious. It was somewhere in between, the expression of a person who understands exactly what those words mean and is choosing, very deliberately, how to respond to them. "I know," she said. "That's why I moved fast. I have thought about that exchange more than almost anything else in this report. I have thought about it because of what it contains and what it does not contain. It does not contain any of the things you might expect. No speech about leaving no one behind, though that principle was clearly in operation. No declaration of heroism, no acknowledgement of personal risk, no moment of emotional processing about how close everything had come. Just a simple, direct statement of causal logic. You had concluded it was over. Therefore, I moved fast. As if the conclusion was the only part of the situation requiring a response, and the correct response was obvious, and the obvious response was just to go. I filed my observation report that evening. My supervisor read it again, and then called me on comms. She asked me to confirm several specific details. I confirmed them. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Velhari, you've been on observation rotation for, what, 6 years now?" I told her 8, she said. "And in 8 years, how many times have you written the phrase subject moved before the situation had formally registered as an emergency?" I told her once. This once, she said, "Right," and ended the call. The formal review of the incident took 3 weeks. The geological survey of Pebble was reclassified from low risk to do not approach under any circumstances, which Das Velcanor received with the exhausted vindication of someone who has been saying exactly this for days. Ashari Tun spent 2 weeks in medical, had her lower limb segments properly repaired, and returned to duty with the slightly altered quality that people sometimes carry after a thing that nearly ended them. Not diminished. Clarified, somehow. Like the experience had removed something unnecessary and left only what mattered. She requested, during her recovery, that Priya be assigned to her next survey team. The request was noted and approved. Fadosi Bek, for his part, became noticeably calmer after the incident. Not in a subdued way, in the way that some people become calmer after they have been frightened at a fundamental level and discovered they did not collapse. He started paying closer attention during briefings. He stopped fidgeting. He began tentatively to throw tension lines with consistent accuracy, practicing in the cargo bay during off hours, which several crew members witnessed and said nothing about because it seemed important to him. Shorev's plant recovered fully. She has since named it. I am not going to put the name in the official report because it is 23 syllables long, and in Mulan it apparently means something like, that which endures the heat and remains green. And if I include it, I will have to explain it, and we will be here all cycle. As for Priya Natthakon, she returned to duty the day after the incident. She attended the preliminary debrief, provided clear and detailed responses to every question, ate something from a small container during a break that I again declined to ask about, and then went back to her station. I caught her in the corridor that evening. This was not standard observation protocol. I want to be honest about that. But I had a question that the official report did not have room for, and she was there, and I asked it. I asked her what she had been thinking in that 1.4 seconds between the fracture and the moment she moved. She stopped walking. She considered this with the seriousness it deserved, which I appreciated. She was not dismissive of the question. She thought about it genuinely, the way people think about things they have not tried to articulate before. Then she said, I wasn't really thinking, not in words. She paused. It was more like, I saw what was happening, and I saw what needed to happen, and the only variable was whether I was going to be the one to make it happen. And that part wasn't really a question. She looked at me for a moment. Does that make sense? I told her it did not, entirely. I told her that for most species, the calculation of personal risk is not a variable that resolves that quickly or that cleanly. I told her that the gap between recognizing a crisis and committing to enter it typically involves a significant processing period, and that her 1.4 seconds represented something that our behavioral models did not fully account for. She seemed to find this mildly funny. Not mocking, just amused. The way you are amused by something that seems obvious to you, but apparently is not. I think, she said after a moment, that for us, the processing period and the moving period are kind of the same thing. Like, I don't figure out if I'm going to do it and then do it. I figure it out by doing it. She shrugged slightly. I don't know if that's a human thing or a me thing. I told her my current data suggested it was a human thing. She said, huh, and seemed to find that interesting, and then she went back to her quarters. I stood in the corridor for a while after that. I have been doing a great deal of standing in corridors during this assignment, I have realized. It happens when something has occurred that requires more processing time than my standard operational parameters allow for. Here is what I wrote at the end of my report, in the section marked Personal Observations, which my supervisor has noted is consistently the longest section of every document I submit. The human Priya Natthakon did not experience the crisis at a distance and then choose to enter it. She entered it in the same motion as experiencing it. The decision and the action were not sequential events. They were one event, and the calculus that produced that event did not, as far as I can determine, include a weighted assessment of probable survival, which is the calculation that every other species in this coalition would have performed first and quickly, and which would have produced, in this specific scenario, a strong recommendation against action. The human did not perform that calculation. Or if she did, she performed it wrong in a way that produced the correct outcome. I have been observing multi-species crews for 8 years. I have written 412 reports. I have documented courage. I have documented skill. I have documented the quiet, extraordinary competence that coalition service sometimes produces in individuals of every species represented here. But I have not, before this, documented something that I can only describe as the specific and deeply unreasonable willingness to treat the worst possible moment as simply the moment that requires action. Not heroism as a choice, heroism as a reflex. The gap between danger and response so small that it does not appear in the data as a gap at all. The human Natthakon, when asked what she was thinking in those 1.4 seconds, said she was not thinking in words. I believe her. I am updating my standard assessment for human tactical personnel. The previous classification was, quote, medium threat evaluation, probably fine. I am replacing probably fine with something that I have been trying to word precisely for 3 weeks and have finally settled on. The new classification reads, humans in proximity to a solvable crisis are not a tactical support element. They are an event. Plan accordingly. End report. Velhari Os, Senior Observation Specialist, Murmur of Distant Stars. Filed under Crew Behavioral Analysis, Human Operational Anomalies, and a third category I created specifically for this assignment and have titled, simply, See Attached. The attached document is 47 pages long. I expect it will grow.